Well, Islam is intolerant of enslaving human beings. The religion eradicated the institution of slavery thanks to the principles set in motion by Muhammad, who was an abolitionist.
There's not a hint of intolerance for slavery anywhere in the Quran. This so-called holy book explicitly gives slave owners the freedom to sexually exploit their slaves. Not just in one place, but in at least 4 separate surahs. Islamic law is littered with rules concerning the treatment of slaves, some of which are relatively humane, but none that prohibit the actual practice by any stretch. The very presence of these rules condones and legitimizes the institution of slavery. Adding to this is the fact that Muhammad was an avid slave trader. After providing ample evidence of his activities according to the most reliable Muslim biographers, the Center of the Study of Political Islam summarizes its findings, quote, Muhammad captured slaves, sold slaves, bought slaves as gifts of pleasure, received slaves as gifts, and used slaves for work. The Sirah is exquisitely clear on the issue of slavery, end of quote. Even the very pulpit from which Muhammad preached Islam was built by slave labor on his command. As such, this deeply dehumanizing horror has been a ubiquitous tradition of Islam since the days of Muhammad to the current plight of non-Muslims in Sudan, Mali, Niger, and Mauritania, as well as other parts of the Muslim world. There has never been an abolitionary movement within Islam, just as the religion produces no organized resistance to present-day enslavement. The abolition of slavery was imposed on the Islamic world by European countries, along with other political pressures that were entirely unrelated to Islamic law. Although horrible abuses of slaves in the Muslim world were recorded, there has been little inclination toward the documentation and earnest contrition that one finds in the West. Shame and apology, no matter how appropriate, are almost never to be found in Dar al-Islam either. Caliphs, the religious equivalent of popes, maintained harems of hundreds of thousands of young girls and women, captured from lands as far away as Europe, and consigned to sexual slavery. Hungarians were hunted like animals by the Turks, who carried 3 million into slavery over a 150-year period in the 15 and 1600s. African slaves were often castrated by their Muslim masters. Few survived to make families, which is why there are not many people of African descent living in the Middle East. The 400,000 slaves brought to America, for example, have now become a community of 30 million, with a much higher standard of living than their African peers. There is no William Wilberforce or Bartolomé de las Casas in Islamic history, as there is in Christianity. When asked to produce the name of a Muslim abolitionist, apologists sometimes meekly suggest Muhammad himself. But if the slave owner and trader who commanded the capture and sexual exploitation of slaves, and left a 13th century legacy of divinely sanctioned slavery, is the best that Islam can offer, then no amount of sophistry will be enough to convince any, but the most ignorant.
Islam is completely incompatible with acts of terrorism. It is against Islam to kill innocent people.
Even though folks like you want to be nice and not want to do that, the truth is certainly more complicated. This is why the jihadists and their detractors are both able to point fingers at the other while confidently insisting that they are the true Muslims. It is also why organizations that commit horrible atrocities in the name of Allah, such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and Al-Qaeda, receive moral and financial support from mainstream Muslims and Islamic charities. In fact, the definition of an innocent person is far more ambiguous in Islam than Muslim apologists want others to know. So, also, is the definition of terrorism. First, consider that anyone who rejects Muhammad is not considered to be innocent under Islamic law. A hypocrite is considered to be a Muslim in name only. They are distinguished either by an unwillingness to wage holy war, or by an intention to corrupt a community of believers. When Muslims kill Muslims in the name of Allah, which occurs quite frequently, they usually do so believing that their victims are munafiqin, or kafir, or unbelievers. This is actually a part of Islamic law known as takfir, in which Muslims are declared apostates and then executed. In addition to the murky definition of innocence, there is also the problem of distinguishing terrorism from holy war. Islamic terrorists never refer to themselves as terrorists, but always as holy warriors. They consider their acts to be a form of jihad. Holy war is something that Muhammad commanded in the Quran and Hadith. In Surah 9:29, he establishes the principle that unbelievers should be fought until they either convert to Islam or accept a state of humiliation under Islamic subjugation. This is confirmed in the Hadith by both Sahih Muslim and Bukhari. In many places the Prophet of Islam says that jihad is the ideal path for a Muslim, and that believers should fight in the way of Allah. There are dozens of open-ended passages in the Quran that exhort killing and fighting, far more than ones of peace and tolerance. It is somewhat naive to think that their inclusion in this eternal discourse between Allah and man was of historical value only and not intended to be relevant to present-day believers, particularly when there is little to nothing within the text that distinguishes them in such fashion. Even many Muslims who claim to be against terrorism still support the insurgency in Iraq, for example, and often entertain the allegation that there is a broader war against Islam. And I see these American politicians trying to bring democracy to Iraq, or whatever. They just don't seem to understand that the problem with Iraq is their religion. Although I use Iraq as an example here, this goes the same for Islamic terror, from the Philippines to Thailand. Wherever Islam is a minority, there are always radicals who believe that violence is justified in bringing it to dominance. Just as Muhammad taught by example in places like Mecca and the land of Al-Harith. Apologists in the West often shrug off the Quran's many verses of violence by saying that they are only relevant in a time of war. To this, Islamic terrorists would agree. They are at war.
Islam is a democracy.
I would point this out as another of those degenerating lies that do nothing but destroy the real meaning and are pliants for words. A democracy is a system in which all people are judged as equals before the law, regardless of skin color, faith, or gender. The vote of every individual counts as much as the vote of any other. The collective will of the people then determines the rules of society. Under Islamic law, only Muslim males enjoy full rights. The standing of a woman is often half that of a man's, sometimes even less. Non-Muslims have no standing with a Muslim. A body of clerics interprets the law and applies it to all circumstances, social, cultural, and political. The people are never to be placed above the Quran and Sunnah any more than men should be above Allah. There is no denying that the tiny handful that are often held up as democratic nations are ones in which deep tension exists between the government and religious leaders, as the latter often complain that it is an idolatrous system imposed on them. Islam is more of communistic fascism. Not a religion of peace, but a political activist system.
Silence, you infidel. The Quran is to Muslims what the Bible is to Christians, and the Torah to the Jews.
The Quran only contains what is presented as the literal words of Allah, as relayed by Muhammad. The chapters of the Quran are arranged by size and themes are rarely consistent even within each chapter. By contrast, the Bible contains history and biographical detail. For example, there is nothing in the Quran that details Muhammad's life, whereas the Bible contains 4 Gospels that present all that is known about the biography of Jesus. Another distinction is that when the Bible displays war, as it does in a handful of Old Testament verses, the intended target is explicitly defined within the passage, leaving little doubt that it is a recounting of history, and not at all an open-ended command for anyone else to do the same. The random arrangement of verses, and their absence of context makes it difficult to understand. For this reason the Quran is rarely printed without the incorporation of voluminous commentary that usually expresses the personal preferences of the translator. In fact, the Torah is the Old Testament of the Bible. The Quran, Hadith, and Sirah are the Muslim counterparts to the Bible. The Hadith is a collection of anecdotes and historical accounts of Muhammad's life, based on the relayed narrations of those who lived with him. The Sirah is the biography of Muhammad's life. Again, there are reliability issues which would appear somewhat bewildering to Christians, given that the Gospel was well in place within the first few centuries after Jesus' ascension, which preceded Muslim history by over 600 years. Still, the most reliable biography of Muhammad was compiled by Ibn Ishaq, who wrote about 150 years after his death. His original work survives only in what was edited by a later translator, Ibn Hisham, who confessed that he filtered out several accounts that were of a distasteful nature. A failure to recognize that the Bible is only comparable to the Quran, Hadith and Sirah together often leads to faulty, erroneous accusation and misplaced analysis. You see, Muhammad was nothing but a narcissist, misogynist, rapist, pedophile, lecher, torturer, mass murderer, cult leader, assassin, terrorist, madman, and a looter. Allah is false, Mohammed was a lice-infested child rapist liar, the Quran is a plagiarized and perverted Torah, twisted by a degenerate backwards reprobate false prophet. Friend, I could go on. But I tell you the truth. You cannot trust in religion to save you. Only Jesus can do that. You still have the chance to accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. Beware of Islam,